No, everything is it's fabulously fierce. I'm getting well hammered. I
Mm.
won't bore you with the narrative details, but if you open to the light, then the depths are to be plumbed and not fathomed, if I can put it that way.
They are, yeah.
So it's glory, but I do
But
believe that most of us try to avoid the glory. It's just anything but experience the light, making you die a little bit and be reborn a little bit, right?
you're making me think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's great distinction between cheap grace and costly grace.
Well, I think I'm paying top dollar, brother.
Yeah. Well, I think I think there really is something there, this light. I can't remember if it was C.S. Lewis or Thomas Merton who said that it's a difficult thing to bear the beams of love.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful.
And in fact, Thomas Merton went even further, and he said this process of sanctification, and I realize that word is not to everybody's taste, but let's use it anyway. This process of sanctification for Thomas Merton was like the resetting of a body of broken bones.
Oof.
And it's a powerful thing, and again, maybe people will object to the language, but what is crooked sometimes needs to be broken and straightened.
I don't even think there's any question about the sometimes, James.
Yeah. And the sad thing is, what's crooked is we find it really hard to cope with love.
To cope with love.
We find it hard to cope with love. It's I've been thinking about this in the context of therapy, because I'm doing my little bits of study into counseling.
It's cool.
And we go to therapy really in a search for love and wholeness, but often in front of an incisive therapist, we flee, we run for the hills. We can't bring what we think is our whole self to that encounter. So I'm with you. You say the word glory, but it's not cheap glory.
No. And one of its characteristics is how many layers it has, that you're forever shedding new skins. So I want to hear more about what you think about Bonhoeffer, because he's somebody that's always been on the edge of my radar. I've come in full on him a few times and done some dives into the reading, but he always gets kind of crowded out by Heidegger and Tillich. But I have a sense that there's kind of more. There's something else there in Bonhoeffer that I'd love to hear you about from you. But
I can't comment on him philosophically.
No, it's just I'm just asking for your riff on him.
Yeah. But before you said before.
Yeah, before that, I just want to read a line from a novel that I've been rereading.
Okay.
It might set you up, and you might not know about this writer. His name is R.A. Lafferty, Lafferty. Best description I would say is acid Catholic, psychedelic Catholic. Like, he drops the entheogens and finds God like absurd and marvelous and terrifying, right?
Right. Yeah.
No cheap grace here. It's costly grace.
Okay.
And this is the opening page of one of his. I haven't read all of his novels, but one of his most remarkable ones. And it starts off with a quote from Teresa. It says, these are all these obstacles for us to meet, and there's also the danger of serpents, right? So there's all these obstacles. Yeah. So it's like, hey, yes, you're going to open yourself up, and there's going to be these obstacles and these serpents. And this is how it opens. There is entwined 7-tentacled lightning. It is fire masses. It is sheets. It is arms. It is 7-colored, writhing in the darkness, electric and alive. It pulsates, it sends, it sparkles, it blinds, it explodes. It is 7 murderous thunder snakes striking in 7 directions along the ground, blindingly fast, under your feet, now, at you. And you have glanced in here for about a moment. You are already snake bit. It is too late for you to withdraw. The damage is done to you. That faintly odd taste in your mouth, that smallest of tingles which you feel, they signal the snake death. And this is the part I wanted to lay up for you. Die a little. There is reason for it.
That is magnificent. Well, I have never heard of this guy.
Yeah, he's very obscure. But I have a friend who I'm working with who's writing a book on him and heading to Oklahoma to look at all of his papers that are in Tulsa, of all places,
right.
The library there. And to me, it gets at that costly grace quality that, that as we open to metanoia, we have to be aware that those openings are a great blessing, and they're also our life's work. Then, okay,
yes.
It's not it's not all unicorns and marshmallows, right?
That's right, and I love it that you say our life's work, because I think there's a tendency to present spirituality as an accessory that you have to otherwise improve your life. Spirituality happens so that your plans can go to plan.
I'm going to take a little bit of mindfulness, and then I'm going to flourish. Okay?
Yeah, that's right.
Because that's my plan.
And secretly, even though as a character I've always been quite hardcore about things, secretly I think I uncovered that in the book I wrote. I discovered my own agenda, that I was enlisting God as my second in command. What you just read really reminds me of, it's almost like Ezekiel's visions and things, isn't it?
Yes.
But it reminds me of the great passage in Exodus where Moses holds up the staff with the snake on it. And you have to look at the snake. You have to, in some senses, pay homage to the snake in order to be inoculated against its venom, because all these snakes are ultimately us.
Yes.
I remember, did you ever watch that great little documentary on the Tibetan Book of the Dead with Leonard Cohen narrating it?
No, but that sounds fantastic, since those are 2 fabulous things in their own right. Leonard Cohen.
Aren't they just? Yeah. So I'll send you a link, but I think it's on YouTube, and Leonard Cohen narrates the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And part of it is done in animation, and part of it is the story of a young monk with his Rinpoche, and they're going out to read the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Do you know if it's the Evans Wentz translation?
I'm not sure of the translation.
I'm hoping so, just because there's such charm in it, and people love to complain that it's old and colonialist, but you can learn a lot from just the impact of the cultures, right? That Evan Wentz, I believe studied, he studied both with William James and Yeats.
Wow.
Anybody who is at the convergence of that, as well as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, not to mention the future Leonard Cohen, right? Hopefully.
Absolutely.
That there's that we can really, we can experience some of that lightning I was talking about if we'll really give ourselves over to something like that. Because
and what I love about it, and this is one of the things where Christianity hasn't really developed a fluid language, but that section in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, when what appears is monsters.
Oh yes,
the key is to understand that these are you. These are projections of your own mind.
Yes.
The snakes the snakes are you, and that's difficult to come to terms with. We've been so conditioned that we can only be loved and we can only exist, and it's only the good aspects of us.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
It's that blood in our hands from Cain that you mentioned, I believe, in Naked Mystic, that we're soaking in it.
Yeah.
No, and the key is to maintain on almost kind of mirthful equanimity and look past those demons as ourselves and to perceive Rigpa, or the clear light. And that too is nothing but us, right? Like
that's exactly it. Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah.
And to me, that's very quicker.
It's interesting that you can't, the demons come first.
Oh.
Those bits have to be. There's an old detail about how when the high priest used to go into the Holy of Holies in the desert, there was apparently a sort of makeshift bronze mirror in which he had to look before he went into the Holy of Holies, and it's all a way of expressing that confrontation with the demonic self, you know.
Ditto at the Greek mysteries at Eleusis. As I believe how you pronounce it, there's the omphalos stone, which is like a huge agate, essentially, that is polished and burnished. And before you go underground and explore the myth of Persephone directly,
right,
and do the hymn to Demeter, you get soft eyes with the omphalos stone. And the soft eyes with the omphalos stones, you can't find where you start and the stone ends, and vice versa, right? So you get a kind of proprioceptive experience of, hey, the snakes are you, okay?
Right.
And not just you, but they're you. And that's why we tremble, right? That's the fear and trembling.
So I'd love to ask you, can I ask you a personal question?
Sure.
Now? That moment of getting soft eyes, that moment of beginning to see the evil, if you like, that you had been projecting onto the world, had a happy home in you. Do you remember when that started for you? Or do you remember when you first gave yourself permission? Because the reason I'm asking the question is that in my understanding, which is hugely influenced by Christianity, when I first started to understand the cross, that was when I began to understand that God was, I was able to take my darkness.
Accept.
Yes, and those words that are still probably the most important for me in the gospel, forgive them, Father, because they don't know what they're doing. That was the moment I began to have compassion on myself, and realize that a lot of my own destruction was mine, but it was understood and it was okay. Do you remember when that first happened with you?
Well, I don't know about first, but I'll say two moments. One was after dealing with the sudden death of my mother in 1997, and I became suicidal and really went down as far down into the bottomless pit as I had ever been, and began to somehow actively reconstruct myself through forces that were not my conscious personality, if that makes sense. Like, I was told, get in the pool to swim. I couldn't swim very well at all. I was a gasping, heaving mess. So when in the process of that reconstruction, I was seeing a therapist who was kind of breaking down all of my blockages. He would just ask me to tell the story of my life, and I would say something, and he would say, "Wait a minute, stop. Can you say again what you just said? Can you just say that again?" And I would go to say it again, and I would go, oh, and there would be a kind of enormous amount of work that had to be done to allow what was trying to come out there as a kind of occlusion of energy, right?
Mm.
It's just a regular, awesome, run-of-the-mill therapist guy with no particular theory, ran an asylum once, you know what I mean? Like, kind of like a good massage therapist is like, hey, wait a minute, say what you were going to say again, right? And, So in the process of that, I realized that I no longer just had to be not sick, but that I was going to I felt the hint of transcendence. And I first felt that hint of transcendence when I was outside near the woods at in my house. And I had soft eyes with the woods themselves. And the woods themselves and the insects chiming, I think it was a cicada year, just kind of, I melted into it and it melted into me with a little bit of cannabis. And it was this kind of Gaian moment where I was like, I had always known that capacity to have soft eyes with your whole body, you know, had experienced it in sex, but it made me flash on, at least now it makes me flash on then the other moments. There was that moment in my backyard and a moment when I think I was 5 years old and I was having an extremely lengthy and intense asthma attack that lasted like days until finally they got me into an oxygen tent. I mean, it seemed like days. It may have just been 8 hours. I don't know. But I got into an oxygen tent in the hospital in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And I just felt that gasping difference between inside and outside that I was suffering from because I was just being throttled. I couldn't exhale, essentially, right? That I felt the sort of rapid relaxation of that musculature even in my chest and the bronchial tubes. Sorry for all the details, but I can that there was that business of the whole body having soft eyes. And it wasn't just comfort, it wasn't just relief, it was somehow truth, right?
Yeah.
This is how things really are. That your perceived experience of inside and outside is just like, I didn't think about it that way, but like that was the proprioception. I was like, oh, okay, all right. So, but you know, there's been lots other ones, I'm sure, but like for some reason, those two moments come out because I do think it's a kind of very, for me anyway, long stumbling 2 steps forward, 1.5, 1 3/4 steps back, learning how to abide that soft eyes of the body because the conscious mind, the egoic mind doesn't want to surrender to that, right? Because it lives off of the idea that it's somehow separate, that it's a cursor in the world, you know, and so forth. And when it comes up against that, then we flee it. Like you said, we flee it. We run screaming from that love because the ego doesn't know what to do with it. But I actually think we can do so much better at helping people abide that just a little bit more, just a little bit. And then when you start to abide it a little bit more, I feel like your book narrates this in some ways, that when there's a chink, you know, and you're like, hey, there's some light leaking through here, right? As soon as I gave up trying to desperately feel better, I started to feel better. But I started to feel better in this way that had such greater magnitudes than just being relief or just being kind of a hiatus on the suffering, right? Which is how most of my life, I would say, probably was just the seeking of the hiatus from the suffering, the hiatus from the suffering, and then the return of the suffering, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And it sounds as though a lot of it was somehow involved or locked up with your body.
Oh, absolutely.
So when you were talking about your therapist saying, it's almost as though what you're describing, he was seeing things as you said them. He was seeing that your body was participating in this in a major way.
I think you're absolutely right. That like that's why the massage therapist analogy is a good one. Like, he doesn't need to know why that little knot happens. Only that it does, and saying, okay, let's unravel that now. And I feel like, yes, I mean, for me, the whole the healing, the project of healing was a project of body mind. And I had to lead with the body. You know, free your ass and your mind will follow, says George Clinton, right? And in my case, like, I needed to not feel broken. I spent a lot of my life feeling physically broken. And so I had to undergo physical transformation in order to be able to deal with the soft eyes of, you know, for it to be able to abide it. If that makes, to feel it as.
My brother, I've got two brothers, one 18 months younger than me and one 7 years. And the one 7 years younger spent quite a long time in India, and he got into Vipassana meditation. And through him, I developed, I never practiced it, but I developed quite an understanding that in that tradition, what arises in the body, so they're as much attuned to feelings that happen of discomfort or whatever. And it did get me thinking about where trauma or stuckness was located in me, for sure. But I think it's something that I, because of my Christian background, Christianity doesn't attend to it at all. Apart from certain, in the Eastern tradition, they have a tradition of prostrations.
Yes.
And also, I think I explained to you that when you pray the Jesus prayer, you put your beard on your chest. So there is this sense of the body participating. But in Western Christianity, apart from those formal movements in church of genuflection and kneeling and standing, the body is not taken into consideration.
Well, of course, you've got the charismatic traditions, though, with ecstatic dancing.
My experience of those is that they become competitive. So, but also it's like if they can become competitive, you see. So if your sanctity is measured by the degree of your freedom in worship, then it's in your interests to really raise your arms and leap around and just to prove that you're holy. You know?
But it might get you there with the Sufis anyway. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's true.
It's true. It might be like, because in general, you know, as you know, I'm anti-church, right? Because when people gather together in churches, it becomes church, or it becomes temple, or it becomes mosque, or it becomes a herd. When it becomes a herd, we start doing that thing that we do, and we can't blame ourselves for that. You know, the great book Crowds and Power by Elias Canetti, you read it, you're like, wow, this is what human beings are. They're these big collectives of humans that take on these different kind of forms. But in terms of the story you tell in your book, The Naked Mystic, in terms of that kind of, I want to put it in the terms of healing, that kind of healing. Then there doesn't seem to be, and this is going to sound very Protestant, I suppose, but there doesn't seem to be any way out of it being your freaking journey. Okay? Like, that you can't just gather together with other people and lose yourself in the collective, because in that losing yourself into the collective elsewhere, you must do the work that pays homage to what you witness in that dissolution of your own identity, if that makes sense.
And I think that interplay that you're talking about, we might call it the sort of interplay between solitude and community on a spiritual path.
And they're not opposites, obviously, but
They're not.
But solitude has
I
a
think,
bum rap.
but paradoxically, I think that the true community is found on the other side of solitude.
Oh, yeah.
So I think I have a bit in the book where I think solitude needs redefining because, again, I think I said in the book, Thomas Merton was psychoanalyzed by a Ukrainian psychoanalyst called Gregory Zilborg. And he went to see him, and Zilborg said, yeah, you just want a hermitage in the middle of Times Square with hermit written over it. So solitude can be a pose.
Oh, yeah.
Or it can be an escape. But there's a kind of solitude where communal thinking doesn't help you anymore.
That's right.
Where for me, my Christian doctrines didn't help. Rumi didn't help. St. John of the Cross didn't help. And there are those moments where you have to let go of everything and realize. And the closest I've found that expressed is, I think it's in one of the Arthurian legends where the knights go off in search of the Grail. And they all have to pick their own entrance into the forest. And if they go in by a path that's already been worn, or a passageway that's been traveled before, they're on the wrong path.
Yeah. Truth is a pathless land, Krishnamurti.
Yeah, I think so. And and yet paradoxically, I think when you have some experience of that, you start to find a community.
Yes.
You know, I mean, it's curious, when I was really in the depth of what I talked about in The Naked Mystic, it was such a relief to read St. John of the Cross.
Oh, yes.
And it was such a relief to read Evelyn Underhill.
Uh-huh. Oh, yeah.
But then days later, to discover that they were no help at all because I was back somewhere that I didn't recognize, and then I would come back to them, and now I can look back. But even now, there are moments where the solitude is so, and that space breaks my heart because I talk to God then, and I say, God, you are alone.
Yes.
There is just you here in this immense loneliness. How do you cope with this? How do you cope with this loneliness? At least I have moments where I can talk to you, God. How do you cope?
And so I have those moments with you, James. No, I mean, I'm really quite serious. I mean, honestly, I went through such a period where that kind of specific quality of loneliness, which is distinct from solitude, I was just writhing in it. And Gary Weber gave me what I call the stranger in a strange land speech. He says, hey, look, what did you think? You're a stranger in a strange land, man. When you get up in front of that classroom, you're speaking Martian, okay? They do not understand what you're saying. But with your compassion, you create space where you can learn how to be together and to be there for each other as you go through this loneliness. And I literally remember having like a quip, but meaning it entirely. And I've said it many times. Now you know what God feels like when you feel that loneliness. When you're that it's just like, boom, that's mystical union that you weren't looking for. But and that feeling what it really means to be the one has the Dionysian aspect of the ecstatic fusion of everything, but it also has the ain't nobody here but us chickens quality, right? And it's that second one that is so peculiar, I would say, because is, as you say, you're reading John of the Cross and you're saying yes, or you're reading Teresa, or you're reading Lafferty, and you're saying yes. And then there's just some particular quality of your own aloneness. And I don't know how else.
And it's interesting because hearing you talk about, standing in front of a classroom. So there is an estrangement from others. And St. John talks about that beautifully. There's a particular asceticism when the soul finds no one who can understand it. But I would argue that it goes even further than that, when the soul can't even understand itself.
Yep. It's just,
and those are crushing moments, but also incredibly rich moments, because that's when all there is God, in a sense. But you can't understand or relate to that either. And there is this total, I think you used the word abjection about something a while ago, and
yes.
There is this state of abject poverty there. And I think it's only in retrospect that you can call it precious. You
can't call it anything.
No,
no, I agree, and I think it's the very signature of the ego death that you go through in the Naked Mystic.
Yeah.
But then coming out that other side into the costly light, is I don't want to say the carrot that is dangled, but I do think it's fair to call it a promise that if we'll read all these different scriptures, right, even going back to Zoroastrianism, organized as it is around the darkness and the light, that if we'll really be with that aloneness, or that, darkness, in some sense, we can tell this, dark night of the soul.
Yeah.
To really be with it and accept it and surrender to it, we somehow get pulled through the other side because it's inescapably bound up with the light, if that makes sense.
It is, yeah. Well, like in the Old Testament, God is a dark cloud that Moses enters, but is also a pillar of light, isn't he? So
and of fire.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's beautiful that I'm really kind of jealous that you're doing this training.
The training course, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I picked an integrative course, which means that I get to, I'd really love to read as much as I can about transpersonal aspects.
Yes.
And that's why I've been getting into reading a bit of Fritz Perls, who is very crazy and mercurial as he is. Okay, yeah, Ronnie Lang. So he was, he's quite, I know a little bit about him. Was he the divided double bind guy?
He took the double bind theory of Bateson and others and moved on with it, but he's also a beautiful and electric writer and very direct.
Okay.
And was curiously hated by the British establishment, and clearly talking about psychedelics quite a bit in the book, but always between the lines. And I didn't know that he used that language of the transpersonal. That's why I brought him up there. But no, yeah, that I feel like if you have access to a program where you can do kind of that interpretive therapeutic work.
I have access to a really nice little program, and it's an integrative course. So they have a basic grounding in person-centered. They also have in their institution a tradition of teaching transactional analysis, which I find quite interesting.
Which Timothy Leary was also heavily involved in.
And they cover what needs to be covered. So you get quite a bit in your toolbox, but there is room to develop an area of interest and head towards a Viva. So I'm quite looking for, I've cast my net pretty wide, and I'm just going to read as much as I can. And even
Pearls really seems worth rehabilitating, as it were. You know what I mean? That so much happens where people just end up in the dustbin of history.
Yeah.
And you're saying, "Hi, now wait a minute. This guy, when I read this guy, and based on his effect on the people around him, things happen,
They did happen. They did. And I just read his autobiography, which is called In and Out the Garbage Pail. And it is history. it's a crazy story, but there's something about what he talks about, his attentiveness to experience.
Boom.
His central idea, and I think he was very influenced by Zen and some of the teachers at the Esalen Institute.
Exactly.
His sense that everything goes on in awareness, and that's all we really have access to.
The snakes are in your mind, man.
That's exactly it. And his attentiveness to the body. So he would often sit there and say, to a client, what are you doing with your left hand right now? And why are you doing that? What are you protecting? So I find him interesting. I was quite exhilarated.
Well, that's awesome. And does this program then yield some sort of certificate that allows you to practice, or?
You can practice anyway in the UK as a counselor. You can't call yourself a psychotherapist.
I think that's true here. I think in Pennsylvania, you can just put a shingle out.
Yeah.
And call yourself.
What this does do is it gets you accreditation with the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, allows you access to a good insurance and
boom,
ongoing accountability, which I like.
You want some sort of framework. That's the thing. That's why I haven't just hung out a shingle. You know what I mean? And so it intrigues me. My sense is that in the United States, these things are way more well patrolled. That because of the nature of our healthcare system.
I think it's because you probably have a much more robust culture of litigation.
Exactly. Well, you can explain a lot with that. I mean,
in other words, it's probably dangerous to put your head above the parapet in the States in a way that it isn't here. I mean, it's an interesting one for me because I worked as a priest for a good while. I was counseling and I was doing spiritual direction, and I was doing a lot of bereavement counseling and various other things. And so making that adjustment now to doing it in a different way is interesting. I'll tell you one interesting thing I used to do, which was there was a ritual dimension. So I'll give you one example. A woman came in off the street wanting to talk to a priest in New Zealand, in Auckland. And I happened to be the man on duty in the parish at the time. And she walked in and told a very upsetting story about how she was seeing an apparition of a young girl. From memory, this young girl would have been about 5 or 6, sitting at the edge of her bed, end of her bed, staring at her. And she also had with her a very young baby, under 18 months old. Her husband had just survived cancer. And in the wake of that, had so relaxed in his life because he was now alive, and that was a miracle. So he wasn't about to worry about anything. So I think what happened is that this lady ended up carrying the darkness for everyone in the family, because hubby was out windsurfing and you know, life was too short. So we got chatting, and she wanted me to go to her house to cleanse the house, to perform an exorcism really on the house. And I was very happy to do that, you know. But as we talked, it became clear that 6 years before she had her current baby, she'd had an abortion. And that now, for me, it was pretty clear what was going on, but it wasn't for her. She still wanted me to go to the house because she was convinced. And in one sense, who am I to judge? So I went out to the house, got the robes on, got the holy water and the rosemary, and involved the whole family, and something quite wonderful happened. And so my job was a mix of counseling in a ritual context. And this is something I suppose that, you know, that I've moved away from in a sense, because I don't have that job anymore, you know.
Yes, but you still have ritualistic capacities.
I do.
To know that I've performed similar kinds of
It
cleanses.
it doesn't surprise me at all. And the other thing is I think there's a huge. Who was I listening to the other day? I was listening, I think, to a Jungian analyst who I like, talking about the importance of sacrifice. And he had, this wasn't with one of his clients, but his friend was looking for some sort of resolution to a difficult situation. And this analyst said to him, just in passing, well, have you thought of offering a sacrifice? So he went home and cooked a really nice meal, put it on a plate, took it to the seashore, nice. And left it for the seagulls to eat. And there was a real sense in which somehow doing that can shift the heavens, can shift the...
You can certainly shift transpersonal energies. How about that?
I think you can. No,
it is just unmistakable. Otherwise, ritual wouldn't exist. You know,
I think you're right. And other things like relics. I don't know whether you get it in the States, but there's a wonderful TV program here called The Repair Shop, and they've set up in Sussex. It's a beautiful 13th, 14th century thatched barn. Oh. And they've set up a workshop with the UK's finest craftsmen, a furniture restorer, a clock repairer, a metal worker, and people bring in their treasures for fixing. So we've had incredible stories like one woman brought in her great-grandfather's World War I helmet that saved his life.
Wow.
And this thing was restored, and the tears and the connection. And it made me understand the Catholic attachment to the relics of the saints, touching something.
I mean, in the traditions that work with what gets called San Pedro cactus or wachuma,
is that a kind of peyote?
It's a mescaline containing plant used in Peru and also elsewhere. And I have not myself worked with it, but I bring it to mind because there's the shaman, the curandera, works with what they call a mesa, a table that is filled with different objects, and the way those objects are placed and so forth become the kind of, for lack of a better word, kind of talismanic cosmic layout for the journey. And so, of course, like when we get into these states, when we're seeing a phantom fetus on our bed, then we're in states that are highly sensitive to what the psychedelic scientists called set and setting, right? And which, Sanskrit tradition understands, for example, that mudra, how you're holding your hands or what you're looking at. Of course, these are all very subtle techniques, and that we poo-poo them, but worship at the altar of the molecule and say, here, squirt this SSRI into your brain. I mean, it's just, it's so crude as to like approach being laughable if it weren't the kind of, hegemonic Babylon of the pharmacratic state that we live in here in the US. So, because that's part of it too, is that we worship so much at the level of the biochemical, like it's essentially official state policy that we're bags of chemicals interacting, right? Which feels great, James. It feels great to think that you're a bag of chemicals interacting. And among other things, it creates this addiction to the health state that we have at the same time that we don't have any reasonable health insurance, right? So it's we're looping back to the double bind, right? Yeah. You need us. We have the power. We have the grail. Whereas we poo-poo and say, oh, what a crackpot. James R.Q. Clark goes over to somebody's house, puts on some robes and says a few words, and he thinks something happened. It's just a hoaxster. It's like, go and be there for that and say that. go and do something like take a bunch of writings from an ex that you've had a difficult breakup with and bring them in and love them with all of your heart and then cut them up and then put them in the fire.
Yes.
And tell me something doesn't happen.
No, that's right.
So
And the obverse of that is, well, you know, singing someone happy birthday. It's just a bunch of people. Look at them. What are they doing? It's meaningless, but it's not. Within that mesa that you were describing,
exactly.
Within that little microcosm or that world, these things make sense and have a place.
Right, yeah. And that's where we live. We live on that mesa. Like, whereas we get sold the abstract mesa, we get told like, oh no, you live in this objective world where these things.
Well, it's even worse than what you were describing, isn't it? Because as well as the sort of biochemical diagnosis or whatever, we're told that we're just pumped with messages about wellness.
Oh.
So the message is, be this well.
Yes.
And inevitably what they'll show you is some gorgeous Scandinavian creature dressed in white with just the right suntan. Be this well, but you can't be this well. And it's just, it's crazy. I mean,
gotcha.
At least in the UK, we don't have to have perfect teeth like you guys.
Well, why do you think we have perfect teeth? Because we've been told, be this well, right? You know,
yeah,
no, that's a very interesting one. In fact, that also, I think, has to do with the fact, you know, that we are so many genetic groups here because, you know, one of the things, the genetics of teeth are fascinating, in fact, and like in you know, in some traditions, it would be the women of the culture that would look at the teeth and say who should pair with whom. Because they had a kind of implicit understanding of genetics based on who can pair with whom. And then like everybody just came here and that's glorious, right?
Yeah.
But the genetics of teeth means that, you know, I haven't paid attention to it for about 10 years, but a friend of mine was working on the genetics of teeth and that was sort of what I gleaned. It's like, oh yeah, like, you know, because so many different genetic groups were coming together here, then the teeth are worse. And it's the fact that the teeth are worse that calls forth this need to kind of straighten them. That makes sense, right?
Right? I had no idea.
Well, I could be totally wrong, but this was the extent of the research 10 years ago. So, but I don't know. That would be an interesting kind of cultural history to pursue also. Just like, why? How did this fetish for perfectly straight teeth arrive in the United States, but not arrive in England?
And also the fetish, which is often really combined with most people's expectations of spirituality, that health and well-being and spirituality go together. And I think one of the very liberating things, especially in the Christian tradition, is to see how many of the great saints really suffered ill health. From Julian of Norwich's deathbed experiences, yes, to, I was reading about recently that there are some very recent saints in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And one is called St. Joseph the Hesychast, who was on Mount Athos, and he died.
Somebody just contacted me about him.
Yeah, there's a nice YouTube documentary. It's a little sugary and hagiographic. There's a nice YouTube documentary on him. I think it's a channel called Trisagion Films.
Well, maybe if we post this, we should put some links up there with that on there, because literally, yeah, I got an email from somebody out of the blue who had a Philip K. Dick experience and then read about this saint and put 2 and 2 together for them.
Right. About Joseph the Hesychast.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a really interesting, really interesting story. And the Orthodox, I'm learning more about them, and in fact I still do use the Jesus prayer as a sort of basic. We were going to chat at some point about the use of spiritual exercises. We'll do that another time. But
we're doing it right now in a way. I mean,
yeah,
saying like, look, ritual is meaningful, chanting is meaningful. What you're talking about with the the Jesus prayer. We could talk about the prayer chanting distinction sometime, but
I think my thing, I remember watching you with Gary Weber, and Gary Weber was very much of the opinion that, and I don't want to misquote him because I love listening to him. I think my feeling on it is, I wonder if spiritual practices are better understood as a symptom rather than a cause.
That's great. That's great. Absolutely.
And because I'm very reluctant to say, and this goes back to when I discovered David Hume at university, I'm very reluctant to say that anything causes anything else.
Dude, I had the same, my eyes were first opened by David Hume
Yeah.
as an undergraduate, and I went around my house saying, show me cause.
Yeah.
Show me cause. I can't find
That's
cause
right.
anywhere.
Yeah.
It's not
And I think that's the understanding of spiritual practices that I think I rebel against, that you do them because they produce something.
Of course, that's
a bit like the guy who buys his woman some flowers because it's going to get him laid. And listen, let's not underplay the importance of that.
Exactly. I was gonna say.
But I think with God, it's
not all there is.
No. And I think with my spiritual practices now, when I pick up my prayer beads, it's an expression of love, but it's also me, it's a symptom of my longing. It's a symptom of my,
I love it.
It's a symptom of my illness rather than, and what I love about it is it keeps you in touch with your humility.
Oh.
It keeps you in touch with your lack of self-sufficiency.
Mm-hmm.
All those things. So
your vulnerability. No, I only started meditation to survive. I was pulled to just do that. I didn't read a book about it. I just started doing it to try to feel better. And so, as you say, it's a symptom. And then there's the feedback loop. So, we can get out of the causality game altogether, because you get that humility enough, you get that spiritual poverty that you were talking about enough, and you're like, just tell me what to do.
Yeah. The other thing about them as a symptom is that they are such a hopeful symptom. So a friend of mine, who I actually credited in the acknowledgements, he was talking to me about, well, we were talking about spirituality, and I said, well, tell me, is your longing growing? And he said, yeah, it's weird. And I said, well, there it is. So if you've got the symptoms that lead to a spiritual practice, then God is moving, because the longing is growing, and the recognition of your own humility, the recognition that you need something. And so in a sense, the movement is always God's first.
Uh-huh.
Always. As God draws closer, the longing grows and the sense of vulnerability grows. It's beautiful. I think if someone is moved to begin to explore spiritual practices, that's the first thing I think. I think, oh, God's starting to hunt for them, And
then then this helps with something, because one of the mysteries of all this contemporary wellness and flourishing talk is the dirty little secret that, even though it's for sure, as we said growing up in South Jersey, the case that mindfulness practices work and are recognized to work by participants who are subject to these studies, and that they know that they work, they nonetheless stop doing it.
Yes, of course.
Isn't that interesting?
That is interesting. Yeah.
So that there's something that has to be accepted there. There's something very profound there that you can't just decide out of what the great non-dual teacher Jean Klein, right? Yeah.
Jean Klein, yeah.
Yeah, it calls gain seeking. I think it's the kind of inverse of agape. It's like, if you go and you're like, I'm going to meditate so that I can have a deeper life.
Yes.
Well, then there's going to be something there, but like it'll be short term and it's going to be whatever it is. Whereas if you somehow open yourself to that longing that you're talking about, and that longing starts to grow by visiting it, by admitting it, by accepting that longing, by not just trying to crowd that longing out with all the things we use to crowd it out, saying, I know, I'll go meet somebody, or I'll go get some kind of food, or I'll get another book, or I'll find a new spiritual teacher, or I'll get a different job, or I'll travel, or right? Whereas if you just say, like, how about I just feel that yawning absence?
Yeah. But even that is a step of faith, because that's an admission that I am not enough. Mm-hmm. Whatever I am. I mean, when you speak, I'm reminded that I think what you might be talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that grace has to come first in some way. And even some great Buddhist teachers will say that there's a grace here that no one understands.
Bodhicitta. You know? It's the bodhicitta. It's your Buddha nature is coming out. Who knows why?
I love that dialogue, which you probably know very well, between Jesus and Nicodemus. And Jesus says to Nicodemus, the Pharisee, you're the teacher of Israel. And he says, you must be born again. And Nicodemus says, well, how the hell am I going to do that? And Jesus says, you're the teacher of Israel and you don't know these things. And there is this brutal truth that this begins with something none of us can claim, none of us can understand, none of us can earn.
Right.
And that's, I think that would be a real difficult thing if you were a spiritual teacher, to have people in front of you saying, how do I make this happen? And if you're anything like Tony Parsons, I love Tony Parsons, he's warm and friendly but brutal. He says you can't. There's nothing you can do. There's just nothing you can do. Now, I'm not sure about that, but I definitely agree that there has to be some. So in the Catholic tradition, faith is described initially as a response.
Yes.
It's a response to something. Now, it might be a response. Yes, that's right. It might be a response to the beauty of creation. It might be a response to the incomprehensible. It might be a response to your own sense of lack. But something comes first, and there's probably very little you can do about that.
Right. Very little I completely agree with.
Yeah.
But it's like, Ramana always answered this one by saying, well, you only have one thing you can do, and that's surrender. Right. And of course it's a paradox, because like, who's there to surrender and so forth. But it's a practice. It's got a ritualistic quality. You say, well, instead of pondering the logic of who's there to surrender, let me see what it feels like to surrender. What does that feel like? Just experiment with it. Don't. And in my humble experience, if you do that, the longing grows.
Yeah.
Now, of course, you never even get to that point where you're going to try to surrender if something hasn't already been triggered. And that's where the other poet besides Gerald Manley Hopkins that you work with in Naked Mystic, if I remember correctly, was Hounds of Heaven.
The Hound of Heaven, yeah. Yeah, Francis Thompson.
Yes.
And, who was an opium addict.
Exactly.
There's almost as much in his backstory as there is in that poem.
Yep.
Yeah.
So maybe we should do one on him sometime, because that poem is obviously available for free online. We could work with it, because what my humble experience is, again, and maybe if you say humble so often you're not, but it's always just that attempt to say, like, look, this is just how it freaking happened to me. Yeah. Like, the more I look at other people who are experiencing that longing, and that longing, the growth of that longing, but also the flight from the longing, the more the longing itself seems to grow. It's not enough. Thompson can't explain to me, like, that I've been stalked by this feeling of soft eyes since I was 6 years old, right?
Yeah.
But there's some kind of resonance that occurs that is not really capturable by language, but which you can use language to help induce. And the poetry of Hopkins, I think, works this way as well. Or this is why I've been reading Isaiah so much lately in the King James Version.
Yeah.
The cadences themselves do work on you that open you to being able to abide that longing a little bit more.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, well, what? You know, like, I'll just give me a beer. Right? You know, like I don't want to feel that absence, not right now.
Yeah.
Right? You know, but the more you can say, like, oh, like Thompson, I can feel Thompson feeling that as well. Like, not yet. Nothing. I can't
That's
deal
right.
with this.
Like Saint Augustine, make me chaste, but not yet.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
It's really interesting because I think, and again, I mean, I don't want to be arrogant, but I think I was a bit of a master at distracting myself. I mean, I loved booze and smoked. In Europe, it was mostly, I lived in Paris for a while, and
you got that good hashish.
I got the good hashish and
the Moroccan and Lebanese hash.
Yeah, and you know, it was sex and drugs and rock and roll, and I'm
don't knock it till you try it.
Well, I'm wondering as we speak, when was the moment I decided to surrender? And I don't think I ever did, and that's why I think I'm quite big on grace. Mm-hmm. I think that the hound of heaven, which is why I use the poem, chased me till I was exhausted.
Same thing.
Yeah.
Same difference.
Yeah, I suppose it is. I mean, we are talking semantics, but I do think it was either I had nowhere else to go apart from back into my own pain.
Yep.
From which I had been running. But that in itself is an incredibly interesting thing, isn't it? A lot of therapists will say, well, someone comes to therapy with a presenting problem, but then a whole life opens up behind that. And so you start to go into your pain and you try and feel it, and you try and understand it and get in touch with it. And this is where it's layer after layer of the onion.
So where is it in your onion then, James?
I think there are points at which you realize that that the pain is yours, but also not really yours. And I think this is one of the powers of the Christian practice of confession, that you're going to a confessor to say, I did this, or I thought this. But by implication, what you're also saying is, I have become this because I've done this so many times. I have become a mean-spirited. And then somehow through the practice of confession, that identification dissolves.
Yes.
And so there's this paradox where you have to become the false self and own it before you see that it's not really there at all.
This is what Philip K. Dick did over 9,000 pages.
Okay.
He had to exhaust his, you say it so that you see that it's not you. You say it so that you see that it's not you. You say it so that,
and you really believe it's you.
Yeah.
But somehow through a genuine confession and through a genuine acceptance that you have become this thing that isn't you, it's a complex thing to explain, but it's like the mirage vanishes.
Yes. You've mistaken yourself for an idea you had of yourself based on some things you think you did.
That's right. Yeah. Something like that. It's something like that.
But were as much happenings that occurred through you as they were things you did.
Yes, that's right. And yet there is also somehow a reality to it, because there is a genuine contrition. Mm-hmm. That you have harmed. Mm-hmm. You have harmed the beauty which is God. You have harmed. And this is something I really, we're constantly tempted, aren't we, to say, well, this isn't really real. But it is, and yet it's not. Yesterday I was driving along and I was literally thinking, emptiness is form and form is emptiness.
Rupam sunyata sunyataiva rupam.
That's right.
Doesn't that sound beautiful?
And I thought, why do I need any other miracle apart from that?
Don't.
So this incredible thing that we're living is not what it seems to be, and yet it is what it seems to be. And I do love that. And I think there's a real temptation, isn't there, to come down on one side or the other, to say, actually, it's all emptiness, and this doesn't matter, you know.
But if you chant Rupam Sunyata Sunyataiva Rupam, which is such a beautiful, like, you know, chiasmus, they call it in rhetoric. It goes at Rupam Sunyata Sunyataiva Rupam. It's like those cadences of Isaiah. You keep saying it, Rupam Sunyata Sunyataiva Rupam. And you don't have a position on emptiness or form. There just is the fact that form is emptiness, emptiness is form.
It's like those Mobius things you were talking about,
exactly.
Isn't it?
Rupam Sunyata Sunyataiva Rupam is a Mobius strip, right? It goes inside and outside of itself. So it's so beautiful, those moments. And it's amazing how often those happen to people when they're driving.
Yeah. Well, I do a lot of my good thinking driving. I'll often get in the car and literally trickle along for an hour or so, because there's something about that automatic movement that just allows for that to happen for me. And the other one,
secret is you can do that all day, in the car, out of the car, whatever. Because I mean, we're such automatic creatures that you just let it happen.
Well, most of our life is just lived on automatic, isn't it? It's putting out garbage and buying food and cooking.
It's great that it's automatic. I'm so glad that I don't really have to think about it. I just find myself brushing my teeth, you know, like, here comes the floss, right? You know, like, oh, I'm meditating now. You know, this is what the observer, you know, occupying that observer mode of consciousness teaches you. It's just like, watch how it all happens. Just watch. But it's obvious when you're driving, because it better all be happening automatically. Otherwise, you'd be dead. Everybody else would be dead. I mean,
that's right.
So it's very funny, but there's something soothing. Like, that's a very well-designed space for it. I mean, that's the great irony of the internal combustion engine automobile, which of course is the great, you know, mode of destruction, you know, that we've loosed upon the planet. But nonetheless, even there, we're able to find that space. Even there, it's all Shiva, you know, that it's that there we are, essentially all meditating, if we'll let ourselves, rolling along in our sport utility vehicles. You know, I don't mean to vilify it too much, but it's just so often I see the cars and I'm thinking, where are these people going? Like, what are they doing?
Somewhere very important.
Why does all of this need to be done? And I know that that's going to sound incredible to some people, but there's a moment in the great George Harrison documentary, I think it was done by Scorsese, where he's in his garden. And of course, you know, he's a privileged, wealthy recluse planting trees, a beautiful human being. And he just looks out at the street and saying, like, where are they all going?
Yeah.
And
have you read I keep coming back to him. Have you read much Thomas Merton?
Oh, I have. Yeah, I love Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton was part of my ability to have a pathway where Christianity could become
wasn't quite so toxic.
And he's
so you know that great passage where he goes into Louisville to the dentist, and he's standing at the traffic lights waiting to cross the road, and he said something like, I can't describe it, but suddenly I looked around and everyone was shining like the sun.
Yes.
And he says, if only people knew that they were shining like the sun.
Exactly. But you know what? Now that Merton wrote it down, we know it a little bit more. I mean, and that's where, like, we recognize a little bit more. We accept it when we get our glimpse, instead of just going, and just shrugging it off, because you can see it. And I've had students that very passage, I believe it's that very passage. I've had students who are actually, they wouldn't work with me. They were afraid to deal because they were, who knows why, but they did a very good PhD. And when it was all over, they told me, oh, that passage, Merton, that particular one.
Yeah.
Every now and then I can see that. And I was like, that's right. And you just accept that. You don't even have to nurture it. You just accept it. No, I love Merton, and I was even wondering it might not be a fun. I don't know where Thomas Merton's papers are. I love these kind of journeys where you drop into an archive somewhere and say, like, well, hey, is there anything unpublished here? I mean, he's obviously.
I think they've done a pretty good job. I think there's a Thomas Merton Center somewhere in the
There
States.
is, yeah, and there's what I have found whenever you go to one of these places, there's always something. There's always some little fragment that wasn't taken up, or like, and so forth. And nonetheless, you can also read the other stuff, because his story, as represented in Seven Story Mountain, but also all throughout, is as much of the story as the rest of the writings, if that makes sense. Like his journey, and then his last journey to Asia, where he goes, holy cow, these people are all on about the same thing as I am. That's a very beautiful thing. And his role as part of what I like to call the lay intelligentsia in the English-speaking world and elsewhere, and his role as really part of the counterculture and part of the civil rights movement. Obviously well recognized by Thomas Merton Center, but our larger culture does not really.
Oh, but he was top of the New York bestseller list for
yes, but that means nothing now.
Yeah. So I was 21, living in my parents' flat in Surrey. My father worked abroad, and I had this incredible religious experience. A relationship had just finished, and I built my whole world on this girl. And all of a sudden that was gone, and I went to bed, and suddenly, and I wrote about it in my book, suddenly God was in the room. So this boy who had been brought up culturally Catholic to a Catholic boarding school suddenly discovered this was all true. And I walked miles to a Catholic church, got to the priest's door planning to tell him what had happened, and couldn't bring myself to do it. So I turned away. Because of school and various things, I had some bad associations. But I ended up moving to Paris after that, where I had previously had a job as a bartender in an American Tex-Mex restaurant.
Nice.
Which was fantastic. So I went back because I needed to earn a living, and I just needed somewhere to go. I was quite isolated where I was.
Why not go to Paris?
Why not go to Paris? And I rented what's called une chambre de bonne, which is the servants' quarters in the old Parisian buildings in the center of Paris. The top floor often were the servants' quarters, but a lawyer kept his papers up there, and he rented me this room. And there was a double mattress on, just pretty well on the floor, but on a stack of box files. And there was one tap and a toilet down there. And I was with a whole bunch of other students and layabouts living up there. And under his mattress, and this is literally days after my conversion experience, was the Seven Story Mountain in English. And so the first book I read as a newly enlightened person who suddenly thought, bloody hell, this is real, was The Seven Story Mountain by Thomas Merton. And it just blew my.
It's a mind blower.
It is a mind blower. It is a mind blower, and it's very stilted. It's very pious. It's all the things that people criticize.
But it's of its time.
It's of its time. That's right. And I remember reading that there's a passage where he goes to Gethsemane, and there is someone in the choir stalls who is not yet wearing monk's robes. And then the next day, this guy has he's entered as a postulant, and Thomas Merton can no longer see him because he's in a white robe. And he writes about this as though this man is disappearing into the absolute, And I read that, and the longing to disappear into that it just never left me. It was just, yeah.
That's beautiful, brother. That's,
yeah.
you know,
So he was, I think he was my first friend as a Christian, or as a person who was longing for God. He was my first friend.
and again, in case people, people in the United States probably won't, a lot of people won't know, because we have this kind of media version of Christianity in the United States, which is always kind of represented through the lens of politics, and almost never through the lens of experience, which is very interesting, right? That they might not know that, for example, Merton was among the most progressive people of his generation, and
absolutely,
and friends to Martin Luther King. And
absolutely.
So we live in such a kind of memory hole here.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to get that out there, because a lot of times now, is on either side, right?
Yeah.
And that's what's so beautiful about, when I, like the class was lit class that I do, what's so beautiful is that we stand down from all of that.
Yeah.
And another way to stand down from all of that is just read some Thomas Merton. Just read a little bit.
Yeah.
And get set line, you can find it.
Yeah. And what a lot of people also don't understand is that he was, I mean, this had been going on largely with French Benedictines who'd set up ashrams in India, even going back to the 20s and 30s. But what a lot of people don't understand is it's largely down to Thomas Merton that Christians can now talk about what we have in common with Buddhists and Sufis.
Yes.
And he came out with this beautiful line. He said, well, if the early Christians can use Plato, I don't see why I can't use Lao Tzu.
Yes.
Or if the early Christians can make use of Stoic thought, why can't I talk about Hindu thinking?
Well, especially since we're all different, and so these different texts are going to resonate with us differently. It wasn't until I read the Upanishads that I would ever be able to read the Bible. No way.
Yeah.
So that differential temperament is so important, and that's why it's so glorious that we have all these dharmas now, right?
Yes, we do.
Doesn't mean they're all the same and then they just all melt into each other, although on some level, of course, they do.
Yeah.
But there's particular inflections to each tradition and sub-tradition within those traditions that can help each of us as we all have this singular path of the razor's edge, as the Upanishad put it. That reminds me, by the way, have you ever read Somerset Maugham's The Razor's Edge? Of course you have.
No, I haven't.
No. You would love it. And the main character, Larry Doyle, moves to Paris after his first awakening, which occurs as he sees a friend of his lose his head to a propeller on an airplane in World War I. He goes away as the great handsome hero and comes back having seen capital S, and he's got to work it all out. Right.
Oh, okay.
The beautiful book. It's a beautiful book. I think Mom is a very underappreciated writer in the contemporary moment. I think because we think we know what he's up to, but very sumptuous writer, very beautiful writer, very compassionate writer. Doesn't get all of it. And he famously visited Ramana Maharshi and swooned.
Now that I do know, yeah. And he wrote about it, didn't he?
That's in The Razor's Edge. That the sage who is featured in The Razor's Edge is Ramana.
It's Ramana. Okay.
Yeah.
On another note, have you read some of the reviews that have come through on The Naked Mystic?
I didn't see that there were new ones. Are there new ones?
Yeah.
Oh, that's fabulous.
One from the States, which is really, really encouraging. I wanted to know if you knew this person.
Let me see, probably not. I do know. I do. I mean, that's funny.
Lindsay Ann
was a
McCann.
student of mine. Well, we were friends for many years, and we haven't had contact in some time. So
she would
this
have
is an
got that
excellent review.
through the mail. She would have got it through the Metanoia mailing list.
Yes.
I
Wow.
was so touched. I love that last bit. If you found this book, it might help in not feeling so alone.
Which really comments on what it is that we just were talking about.
Doesn't it? And then there's another one from the UK.
I'm
Jacqueline
looking at it right now.
Hogarth.
Beautiful crafted. Yeah.
So that's nice. There's starting to people are starting to talk a little, which is really encouraging.
That's really great.
I did.
Last weekend, I had 2 pilgrims come and visit.
Yeah.
Who had met in a class I taught on Philip K. Dick in 2000. And they, in between, were married and got divorced, and now have reconnected.
Okay.
And came to visit. And one of them I gave my proof copy of Naked Mystic to, because, of course, miraculously in the 20 years since, they're meditating. One of them is an incredible musician. They're going to probably play along in some kind of way for Metanoia. One of them, they're both writers. And so I'm kind of waiting to see when that Naked Mystic goes off in her context. And I think what's so interesting is how consistent the descriptions are, right?
Yeah.
It's not just that this is a good book, it's here's what this book did to me.
Yeah. Mate, it's lovely to chat to you as always.
It's the best.
Yeah.
It's the best. Thank you.
Much love to you and yours from here.
Back at you.